Okay, and I think we're going to talk about context and principles. Yep. So one more part of the model, which I didn't have pictured in my model, but if I could picture it, it would probably be the blue background behind the model. That would be the context, because every communication exchange is also impacted by the contexts. So context simply means like, where did the communication take place and when did it take place? And what was the culture of the time? So physical would be the tangible or concrete environment, right? So let's say I want to break up with somebody. I'm dating them and I'm tired of them and I'm going to break up. So what physical context do I choose? Do I meet them at Starbucks? Do I drop them a text? Do I just ghost them and say nothing, right? That's all physical context. The cultural context would be, what does my culture versus his or her culture bring to the dynamic? So let's say I'm from a culture that's somewhat inhibited. That's a context that's going to impact the dynamic. And if he or she is from a culture that's very outgoing and very expressive, then that's part of the context, right? So your communicator's culture becomes part of the context. We're going to study culture in Chapter 2. The relationships among us is important too, like the norms of my group. For instance, I have a really close relationship with my family. I feel pretty able to talk about almost anything with my family. You might have a different dynamic within your family, and that provides a context. So if you just all of a sudden blurted something out to your family, which nobody has ever blurted before, hey family, I've decided I'm going to drop out of school. And that might be shocking because maybe no one has talked about that kind of thing before. You know what? That's a pretty bad example. Let me come up with another one. Well, there's so my mom is a really good friend of mine, but there are certain issues I don't talk about with my mom. And if all of a sudden I did, then that would be like a difference in the context, right? There are things we talk about and things we don't talk about. So think about your different groups of friends. There are probably topics that are okay in certain groups and not okay in others. So the status of the people involved, we're going to learn another important thing about that on the next slide. That's a part of the communication context too. And then of course the timing, right? So when do I, you and I have just become friends, and when do I tell you maybe a secret that I have? When should I tell you that, I don't know, maybe I've served time in prison? I haven't, but if I did, when should I tell you that? If I don't tell you that for 4 or 5 months and then you later find out, do you feel there's been a breach of loyalty that I should have told you that? So time is a huge communication context, right? When do our messages fit into a sequence of appropriateness? I hope you're starting to see just how messy communication can be as we're just going through some of these elements and how much we just hardly even think about. So little by little in the course of this semester, we'll be studying all these things. And let's just wrap up with some basic principles. As you can already tell, interpersonal communication is very ambiguous, meaning there are many different ways to see and hear the same message. And if this political season hasn't convinced you of that already, I'm not sure that I can. So lots of ways to hear and see the same idea, from they are eating apples all the way down to what is a protester, right? Now, the second principle there talks about interpersonal relationships being symmetrical or complementary. This is super important. Every communication dynamic we're in has either a symmetrical or a complementary relationship dynamic. So symmetrical means that we have equal amounts of power. That might be you and another student. That might be me and another faculty member. That might be me and my sister. And yet, even within those, we might sense some complementariness in terms of a distinction in power. All right, so like I am an adjunct at Webster. I've been teaching at Webster as an adjunct for 6 or 7 years. Would I have more power than a brand new adjunct, but less power than a full-time instructor? Maybe. I'm also at the Merrimack campus of St. Louis Community College, where I'm an adjunct, and there's another adjunct in the department as well. But he's not really an adjunct. Well, he is, but he's also the retired department chairperson who has come back to teach part-time. So while technically we might have a symmetrical relationship, there's a complementary element there too. Now, just because somebody has more power doesn't mean that's a bad thing. For instance, you and I might be roommates, and or maybe we're romantic partners. We live together. Okay, that's awkward. Think of two romantic partners living together, and maybe one of them is better at certain things, and another is better at other things. So there might be a power imbalance, and yet, if both parties find that to be okay, then we have a complementary relationship, but it's not unsatisfying. Later on in a relational chapter, we're going to learn that that's called a balanced split pattern. I'm thinking of my friends Pete and Dixie. Dixie is in charge of all of the housekeeping, but Pete does all of the cooking. Pete does all of the travel planning, but Dixie handles all of their holidays. So there's like this shared split of duties and power. So just because somebody has more power in certain aspects doesn't mean that the relationship is unsatisfying. Anyway, that's symmetrical and complementary. That third principle is also really important because every communication dynamic has both the content, what's being said, but also how that sends a message about the relationship between the two people. Here's a great example. Let's say we're in a live classroom right now, and I'm lecturing, and there's noise out in the hall. And I turn to a student over here in the row. Let's call that person Tasha. Hi, Tasha. And I would be I'm kind of bothered by that noise. Tasha, would you close the door? Okay, did you notice how I did that? Tasha, would you close the door? Now that was me telling Tasha to close the door. We have a complementary relationship. I'm the instructor, she's a student. In a sense, I guess I get to tell her what to do. But it's possible that Tasha was just a little bit annoyed by that. But I'm guessing she would have gotten up to close the door. But let's pretend somebody in another row, Steve, was equally annoyed by the noise in the hall. And as I'm lecturing, Steve turns to Tasha and says, Tasha, close the door. I'm guessing Tasha would have been a little more annoyed by the fact that Steve tells her to close the door because they have a symmetrical relationship. And what Steve did in that dynamic was establish a relationship saying, oh, that looks like I have to do something. We'll mark that later. Thanks, guys. So Steve, told Tasha what to do, and by doing that, he kind of gave a message about their relationship. Now, if Tasha turned back and said, screw you, she's also sending a relationship message. So every communication episode also carries a relationship dynamic. I'm going to skip over bullet number 4. Interpersonal communication is a series of punctuated events in a way that means that since you and I have just now started our communication relationship, it will be punctuated, meaning it will begin and end, begin and end, begin and end. Or let's say it will pause. But once we've started a communication relationship, that transactional cycle is continuing. It might pause, but it's always continuing. So for instance, you run into me in Schnucks in 5 years. I'm like, oh my gosh, how have you been? I remember your face from those silly videos you did. And I say, yeah, I don't think I ever saw your face. It was online class. But yeah, I remember you. So even though 5 years has gone by, there was a pause. It's still kind of feedback on those initial messages that we shared. So that's what we mean by a punctuated series of events. And the last and maybe most important principle of the night is that communication is inevitable, it's irreversible, it's unrepeatable. It's inevitable because you cannot not communicate. If I could try to not communicate, it might look like this. But even by doing that, I'm still communicating, right? I can try to not communicate by not replying to your text message, but by doing that, I'm still communicating, right? Because the absence of communication still sends a message. And if you've ever texted somebody and not gotten a reply, you know exactly what I mean. So communication is inevitable. It's also irreversible. I can't take it back. I don't know what kind of impression I've made on you this evening. I'm saying evening because I'm doing this in the evening. But I don't know. It's irreversible. All I know is if it didn't make a good impression, well, I can try to correct that in my next PowerPoint, but I can't take away the impression you've already had. I can only add information to it. So I can't reverse any message you've already received. And finally, it's unrepeatable. And it's unrepeatable because of the context of time and because of the idea of punctuated events. So if I were to say to you, I think you're awesome. But then I say it a second time, I think you're awesome. The fact that I'm saying it a second time is changing some element of that message, right? You can't ever truly repeat a message because the fact that you are repeating it is adding a new level of context to it. All right, I think that's all I had to share with you in this first Peggy Talks Through the PowerPoint. So I'll be doing these throughout the course. I hope you also watch Scott Jensen's videos. He's really, really good. He's a dear friend of mine. He's the reason I get to teach at Webster because we've known each other for years and have been active in a state association. And it was 6 or 7 years ago that he recruited me to come and start teaching some courses. So I'm grateful to him. He's also a little more intellectual in his descriptions of things than I am. So he might add a tone of rigor where I might add a tone of everyday explanation. So I think together, I think these are going to be a good combination in terms of a way of explaining content to you. All right, I'll see you online. Don't forget to post your discussion replies to DeVito's 6 questions. And you're also going to add your own discussion question at some point this week and choose one of your classmates' questions to reply to. I'm looking forward to reading all of those and replying when I think of great things to say. All right, have a good evening, everybody. Now I have to learn how to turn this off, and I think it's right there.